what are we talking about today?
You're really funny. One of my favorite topics, which is I love talking to people about the St. Pius X Society
Oh, yes. This is something that's top of your mind all the time.
all the time.
No, it's not. It's it's the Pope Pius
I
X.
enjoy reading about it. I don't know, I don't know like a ton of the history, but I'm always fascinated by groups that seem to have this struggle to conform to the teaching and the authority of the church. I'm always super interested in like their reasons and why they do that.
Yeah.
Admittedly, my gut reaction is always like when people are explicitly like, oh, I think the church is so stupid about this thing. I'm always like, well, that's because you're dumb, right? That's my initial reaction. Inside, I don't always say it.
Oh, I'm glad that you don't
It's
say
more
that out loud.
interior.
Yeah.
But then that's almost always followed up by, okay, there's got to be a reason why you think that, and so I'm always fascinated to try to figure out why. So
Jesus said that we shouldn't judge each other. So I would like to honor our Lord's teaching by trying to have a conversation without doing that. But I would share that fascination, but not just on those on the right, but also those on the left, because we can have the same problem with people that won't accept the church's teaching because somehow it doesn't go far enough. That's always the issue. It doesn't go far enough, and then that can be disconcerting, because for the average person out there, they're like, okay, am I missing something here? Like, what am I missing here? Because I think most people don't, think, they don't go that far in thinking through things. Most people just kind of accept more or less what the church teaches, but there's people that dissent in one way or another, or separate themselves from the church for various reasons. And it is interesting to try to understand where they're coming from. And I'm a big believer that there's always a context within which those things happen. And without having some sympathy for that context, then it is easy to judge them and not understand where they might be coming from. So, the reason why I'm bringing this up today is because it's July 1st today. And by the time this episode lands, it'll be a couple weeks old. But the Society of St. Pius X has consecrated 4 new bishops for their community in defiance of Rome, and therefore, they continue to remain in a state of schism. And of course, over the decades since this all began with Archbishop Lefebvre, we've had this kind of split and this fracture in the heart of the church. And of course, it's important to recognize that while they're in schism, there's also many people who sympathize deeply with them inside the church who are not in schism, like people that are part of the traditional Latin Mass community, and also there's an organization called the Confraternity of St. Peter, which is, sort of the Catholic Church's way of accommodating those concerns, but within the fold.
Okay.
But we haven't been able to attain that kind of level of reconciliation with the Society of St. Pius X. So
what's their beef?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to unpack it, because I think that we all need to have clarity around what the church actually teaches and what they don't teach. And it's my conviction that, well, here, okay, how would I frame this? If you look at Vatican II as a turning point in the history of the church, and there's obviously a before and after, and if you don't recognize that there were problems in the church before the council, then you're going to see what happened after the council as being caused by the council.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
Whereas if you believe that there were problems in the church before the council, that the council was seeking to rectify, and that those problems just persisted after the council,
Yeah.
then you have a different perspective. But the other way I would frame it is to say this. Sometimes there were concerns before the council with certain how do I say this? Certain ideas that were circulating around the church that the church had issues with. And then after the council, those ideas seemed to gain some mainstream currency within the life of the church.
Okay.
Which then in the minds of more traditional-minded people validates their concerns that the council itself intended those things.
What are some of those things?
Well, like for example, you could say that, the church was accommodating itself too much to the spirit of the 1960s. And then when the spirit of the 1960s became more mainstream in the life of the church, you can see, you could, one interpretation is to say, you see, Vatican II was just compromising with the spirit of the 1960s, and now we have this big problem.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you can also look at it and say, well, no, I don't think the church was compromising with what was going on in the 1960s, but something was happening culturally and society-wide that eventually sort of co-opted the council. And so there's been an internal struggle with how do we properly interpret the actual meaning of the council. And so some people will look at it and say, well, the council caused the confusion.
Mm-hmm.
And other people will say, no, the council was trying to correct the confusion. And other voices within the church, took it upon themselves to try to impose their agenda, and kind of fit the council into their agenda.
Okay.
And that's when you hear this term, the spirit of Vatican II.
Yeah.
Oftentimes that's what we're referring to. We're referring to a group of people, theologians and clergy, that had an agenda before the council that then used the council as an opportunity to impose their agenda. But in the minds of a more traditional person, they would say, well, that's the fault is Vatican II itself, because Vatican II itself was a compromise, and therefore we can't accept it. And it's only going to be made right when we renounce certain positions that the council took. And as a theologian, my argument is, no, the council's positions were correct, but they weren't interpreted correctly, and they are now. I think that all of that clarity has been worked out. But at the in the 70s and stuff, when everything was unfolding, there was a lot of confusion, and there were different voices that were vying for the proper interpretation of the council. And so that narrative, like that, the way in which you tell the story is going to kind of determine where you find yourself within these intramural debates.
So ultimately, and this is probably dumbing this down a lot, but ultimately, as a person who has an opinion about what Vatican II did or didn't do, ultimately, as a Catholic, isn't it really up to what the church says is, in other words, so what if I think that Vatican II directly is the result of the thing that I don't like in the church? Like, the church herself believes that Vatican II is necessary, and right? So it's like, to go against it. Okay, so if the church is saying, no, the way you're viewing this is incorrect, right? Don't I have an obligation to obey, like to sort of obey that, and
well, you do, but and this has been a problem all the way down through the ages. I mean, like, if you go back into the early church, for example, during the Arian heresy, there was a point in time when 80% of the bishops were Arians in certain parts of, geographically, in certain areas,
Remind me
parts
what,
of the
what
church.
that one is.
Arius just denied the divinity of Jesus.
Okay.
Kind of a major point of
A little bit,
contention.
yeah.
So the Orthodox position was maintained by Rome, but lots of people didn't get on board with that. Then in the schism in 1054 between the Eastern and the Western Church, it wasn't a doctrinal issue, it was a juridical issue. Who gets to decide what's Orthodox and what's not Orthodox? You know, in the Protestant Reformation, you had a widespread corruption. You know, at what point in time do you like how long do you hang on before you have to reform the church? And I think that the reformers started out wanting to reform the church, but as so often happens, when the authorities that have the right to assert these things assert themselves, people can be so dug in and so entrenched in their position that they won't acquiesce to the authority of the church. And that can be hard because sometimes on a human level, the authorities are not necessarily people you want to follow.
Right.
So it's on a human level, it's very complicated. And all the way down through the history of the church, there's always been this problem of, heresy is a little bit easier to sort of flush out. But schism is complicated because what's probably most at the heart of this schism with the more traditional-minded Catholics
Mm-hmm.
is the council authoritative? And who has the authority then to interpret the council? And is every word or everything said at the council binding in the same way or at all? I mean, there's some things stated in the council documents that in fact might not be binding. So how do you discern which is which? Well, we would say, well, it's the magisterium's job to bring that clarity to us. And we believe that because we believe in the authority of the magisterium to do that. But these people have decided that authority seems to be for a time suspended, and that they are sort of the remnant that's hanging on to the Orthodox faith. And in the end, with enough time, we're going to win. But I always say, but you're cutting the branch that you're standing on off of the tree that you're defending.
Mm-hmm.
And so the problem is that you can't make yourself the rule and measure of what is true without in some way ending up being in that kind of quasi-Protestant point of view and perspective.
Yeah.
Because in your desire to reform and renew and hang on to the truth, you've cut yourself off from the authority that God has established for doing just that. So, and that's not to deny that there are periods in the history of the church in which there can be doctrinal confusion.
Yeah, sure.
So,
okay, so
and disciplinary confusion, like around the liturgy, for example. There's different issues. Some are doctrinal, some are pastoral, some are liturgical, which have to do with, the form the Mass is supposed to take, etc.
So walk me through the history of this movement. Like, there was a bishop around the time of Vatican II, correct?
Yeah.
That was like, I don't agree with large parts of this, right?
I wouldn't say it was large parts of it. It was particular parts. So yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to understand that, why do they call themselves the Society of St. Pius X? So Pius X wrote, he was let me go back even further.
Okay.
When Pope Leo XIII was Pope, there was a major contention within the life of the church between those who favored what's called the ancient regime And that was the old kind of, when I say old, like late medieval, early modern relationship between church and state, where we embraced confessional states. Okay, like the Catholic Church, because Europe was largely Catholic, even after the Reformation, the Protestant nations believed in a confessional state. You were the faith of the king, and Catholic nations believed in confessional states. So we believed, as a matter of doctrine, that it was the responsibility of a Christian nation to profess the Christian faith in their constitutions and in their laws. Okay?
Okay.
All right. So what happened after the French Revolution is we had this big movement of the separation of church and state, which the way I like to explain it is it was the privatization of religion. So religion no longer belongs in the public square. It's a matter of private religion. Now, the problem with that belief, which was driven by liberals, in the 1700s, is that if you privatize the faith, then you say, well, then it's just a matter of personal preference.
Yeah.
And if you accept that, then it's easy to take it the next step. Well, if it's just a matter of personal preference, then I'm just going to kind of believe any way I want to. And then if you accept that premise, the next step is, well, if I can believe any way I want to, why do I need to believe at all? And in fact, the way secularism played out through the latter part of the 1700s, through the 1800s, and into the early 1900s, is that's exactly what happened. People became materialistic and atheistic, and Europe lost the faith. So in the middle of that collapse, Leo XIII said he departed. He was not sympathetic with the prelates in the church, the bishops in the church, the cardinals in the church that wanted to go back to the ancient regime because he thought the confessional state was a problem.
Yeah, tell me about that.
Because it gave too much power to the state to control the internal life of the church.
Yeah, okay.
So at Vatican I, they established, the singular primacy of the Holy See, and in the authority of the church and the church's magisterium, and affirmed a kind of distinction between church and state. The state has a certain realm. The church has a certain realm, okay? And the church's authority is greater than the state, but the church is not going to interfere in the day-to-day operations of the state because that politicizes the life of the church, but neither is the state going to keep appointing bishops and keep politicking for who's going to sit in the See of Peter, and we're gonna create a distinction here. And Leo XIII laid that out super clearly. And so it would appear that he was more sympathetic with the liberal establishment than with those sympathetic to the ancient regime, the old sort of national monarchies that were either, were Catholic and imposing, church belief by state fiat. Okay, I know this is a long run-up, but this is, if you want to understand Lefebvre, you've got to know this background.
For sure.
So Leo XIII brought that clarity, and particularly with his teaching on Catholic social teaching, he established that there's a way to navigate the current political and social economic landscape in a way that's neither sympathetic to the old and not sympathetic to the new spirit of the French Revolution.
Yeah.
So he laid the foundations of Catholic social teaching, which provided a framework for Catholics to say, okay, this is how we can live in the new world order, and still be faithful to our Catholic faith. And Leo XIII, it was phenomenal. Okay, but that spirit of liberalism coming out of the French Revolution continued to work its way into the church. Okay, so where Leo XIII was trying to do a very creative work of trying to bring the church's doctrine into conversation and create some clear lines of distinction. Pius X saw what was happening now within our Catholic universities and within our Catholic, even our seminary formation, houses of formation. And he decided that he had to take a hard stand against the spirit of modernism that was now creeping into the life of the church.
Okay.
Pius X, in my opinion, was trying to uphold the vision that Leo XIII had laid out, but he was taking a more disciplinary stance and approach.
Okay.
And so he wrote a very important encyclical called Against Modernism. And he laid out the philosophical and theological errors that were in the air at the time.
Yeah.
And he clamped down very harshly on all of our institutions. Okay?
Okay.
So things became very disciplinary and kind of rigid.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's all happening.
Yeah.
Now, what then transpired after Pius X, and he was like in the very early part of the 1900s, like in the 1900 and,
Okay.
whatever,
Yeah.
like he was very early on. And he kind of established a bit of a precedence. So we had Pius XI, who kind of followed in that same kind of disciplinary tract, although Pius XI was opening up space in the church to begin looking more deeply at, like in a sense, continuing what Leo XIII had started. Like we can't just put our heads in the sand. Like we have to wrestle with some of these issues. Pius XII did the same thing, and so you begin, especially under Pius XI and Pius XII, Catholic social teaching continued to build on the foundation that Leo XIII had established, still within the kind of pastoral context of this kind of disciplinary crackdown, but still with an openness to look at things like democratic principles, market principles,
Mm-hmm.
and questions like of liberty and freedom within society. And you remember what happened from 1917 on. You had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and communism was just spreading like wildfire, and we had World War II. And we had these aggressively secular, atheist, materialistic societies. And we in the context of that, we had an entirely new problem emerge that Catholic Europe, Christian Europe, had never had to deal with, which is, well, what do you do when you live in a society that's shutting down your churches and killing all your people because they believe in Jesus?
Mm-hmm.
What rights do they have?
Yeah.
So by the time we got to Vatican II, we needed to address the problem of religious liberty. And so a document came out called Dignitatis Humanae, which was trying to wrestle with that question. But the problem and the challenge with it was that the issue of religious liberty had been articulated in one context before Vatican II, and for a very different set of reasons than it was being articulated at Vatican II. So let me try to break that open. I know this is a long explanation, but I hope
No, it's really good.
I hope it's helpful.
Yeah.
So prior to Vatican II, in the wake of the French Revolution, the spirit in the air was individual conscience, privatization of religion. Christianity is important for the public square, but let everybody decide how they're going to do that for themselves. It shouldn't be imposed by the state.
Mm-hmm.
The government should remain neutral on matters of faith, and people should be free to practice their faith freely. Like, if you're Protestant in this, if you're a Quaker, be a Quaker. If you're an Anglican, be an Anglican. If you're a Catholic, be a Catholic. But the state is not going to impose religion. We have an amendment one of the articles of our Constitution gives us that exact form of religious liberty.
Yeah.
But it raised a lot of questions because in the mind of Leo XIII, the question in the heart of the church's teachings, the language of the revolution was saying things like, conscience has an absolute right. Error has rights. Like, people should be able to pursue the truth in any way they want to. And so Leo XIII was saying, okay, wait a second. Let's clarify this. Human beings have an absolute obligation and responsibility to profess the true faith that God has revealed and to pursue and embrace that faith to the very best of their ability. And the state has the obligation to acknowledge that true religion.
Okay.
And the church still affirms that even now in the Catechism. It starts with this responsibility that we have. We all have a responsibility to the truth. Yeah. Error does not have any natural right. I don't have a right to be evil. I don't have a right to be in error as I stand before God as his creature. My obligation is to stand before God and say, whatever you say is true, right? And in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, like, that was the driving issue. This kind of spirit of liberalism was literally ripping the fabric of Christian civilization to shreds.
Can I interrupt with a question?
Yeah.
So prior to this, was it more of like it was very strictly imposed upon people? In other words, it seems like what you're saying is there was some kind of a shift where, like, an individual approach to, religion became prominent. But prior to that, was it like this really heavily imposed kind of system? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I mean, during the age of Christendom, under a confessional state, as a Christian, the rule was, after the Reformation, whatever the ruler is, you have to be.
Okay. But I can imagine
so it was a theocratic
there was
type
probably
of
some
arrangement.
Ugliness.
It was not good. And the problem is that it gave the state way too much power over the church. And this had been a problem going all the way back into the 800s and 900s, way back at the time of Charlemagne, like in France, like where you had this kind of tension between church and state, where the problem was when the church becomes too powerful, then state actors try to usurp the authority of the church for their political purposes.
Right.
So what the reason why the Reformation blew up the way it did is because in one sense you could say that the church had too much say over the state. It was too much a church, church controlling the state. But I always say, no, that's actually not correct. Because the church had so much social and cultural influence, it was political actors that usurped the authority of the church to impose their nationalistic and their ethnic agendas.
Yeah.
That's what was really happening that's why the Reformation blew up. So the Reformation was basically a surge of nationalism. And so it resulted on the back end of the Reformation was the Treaty of Westphalia, where we say, okay, if you're a Catholic king, then all your subjects have to be Catholic. If you're a Protestant king, all your subjects have to be Protestant.
Yeah.
Well, what ended up happening is the Catholics inside the Protestant countries and the Protestants inside the Catholic country, they revolted against that, obviously.
Yeah.
So then what they did, what finally resolved that problem was the French Revolution. The French Revolution said, we're just going to separate church and state.
Yeah.
But see, the French revolutionaries went too far, because what they ended up asserting was your religion is your private matter.
Mm-hmm.
And what I said earlier in our conversation is the way things played out.
Yeah.
So by the time we get to the end of the 1800s, Leo XIII is looking at 100 years of this French liberal experiment, and it's been catastrophic on the faith.
Yeah.
So he had to bring clarity to say, Okay, yes, we believe in the separation, this distinction between church and state,
Yeah.
but let us not get lost in the weeds. Let us remember that as a Catholic and as a Christian, in fact, it's true of every human person,
Mm-hmm.
you have a obligation to seek the true religion that God has revealed and to
Yeah.
embrace it when you find it. And he said a little bit about the fact that the state shouldn't be the primary mechanism
Yeah.
of enforcement there, but he didn't say a lot about it. Because that wasn't his concern. His concern was Catholics are becoming French Republican liberals,
Yeah.
and we can't have that.
Okay, so here's my other, and this is more of a statement than a question, but I can imagine that it's almost like similar to what goes on even now. Like in a Catholic state, if you just because all of your people, because the ruling kind of the leader is a Catholic, and so all the subjects are Catholic, doesn't in any way, shape, or form ensure that you have real Catholics.
Well, sure.
They just become Catholics in name only.
Right.
You know, so it's like if a state is not actually forming good Catholics or helping the people who they're making Catholic to understand the real, you know, then it's like, well, who cares? Like, so what? We have all these, you know what I'm saying? It's like,
No,
and then you force people,
Yeah.
and their conscience is telling them, because they might have a poorly formed conscience, it's telling them something else, but they still have a conscience. Like, you know, like this, it seems like ultimately, and this is just my assumption, that we're created to sort of be free to make those decisions on our own.
Right. And I think that, like, what's taken the church a long time to figure out is that only God can legislate faith, hope, and charity. Right? Only God can legislate that, and God doesn't apply, like, he gives us the freedom
Mm-hmm.
to find our way to him in this life. And then at the end of our life, we'll be judged for where
Yeah.
we kind of end up.
Right.
But no earthly temporal authority is given the authority to use coercive power, either church or state, to make people believe stuff.
Yeah.
And we have some good examples in the past,
Yeah.
like Thomas More, St. Thomas More,
Yeah.
and St. Joan of Arc, who are two classic examples dating back to that kind of like early modern period during
Yeah.
the Reformation.
Yeah.
You have two examples where people were persecuted because they exercised their conscience in relationship to what they believed was the true faith.
Mm. Yeah.
Now, in the case of Joan was put to death by Catholics because she was accused of being a witch.
Right.
And Thomas More was, he was put to death as a Catholic because Henry VIII was, naming himself head of the Church of England, and he couldn't go along with that.
Yeah.
So this has been a tension point and a problem. So Leo XIII did an amazing job of sorting that mess out and saying the church and state, he said the state is like the body, the church is like the soul. The church and state need to collaborate and cooperate and work towards the same purposes and ends. But the state has one set of responsibilities. It exercises the sword with respect to civil matters necessary for a commonwealth to exist.
Okay.
The realm of the interior life, faith, hope, and love, those things, that is not the realm of the state. That's the realm of the church.
Yeah.
The church never imposes the faith. The church proposes the faith through the proclamation of the gospel. So there is the emphasis for Pope Leo was on the obligation of conscience.
Yeah.
He rejected the idea of a confessional state. He just didn't really he didn't really go back to the ancient regime. He was like, that arrangement did not really work. Yes, the state has an obligation to seek the truth, just like an individual does, but you can't impose that coercively. It's like it's not the church's job, to do that.
Well, it seems like almost what ended up happening, according to how you're describing the history of this, is that whenever the French Revolution happened and there was like it opened up this more like self-interpretation, like you do what you want to do, it just seemed like it revealed the epic failure of this coerced kind of like thing. Like
Mm-hmm.
it was almost like, oh, holy crap, like we have a bunch of people who really don't know what they believe, even though they've professed to believe in this thing. You know, like that's a big problem. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you're
Okay,
saying.
so keep going with this
so-
leading up to.
So I want to go back. So Pius X, I think he wanted to build. He obviously was in perfect continuity with what Pope Leo was the 13th was doing, but there was a need at that time to kind of crack down on our houses of formation and our institutions because this kind of spirit of the French Revolution was getting in.
Sure.
So he
Okay.
condemned modernism.
Okay.
And then Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII, they maintained and sustained that disciplinary structure, but they continued Leo's project of how do we engage, like where do we stand on all of these issues? And so you kind of see a gradual opening to, while we reject the tenets of the French Revolution, there are certain principles that predate the French Revolution in our own tradition, like representative government, the separation of powers, the idea of liberty and freedom and rights. We have a tradition, and we need to continue developing and refining our understanding of those things. So they put out documents. We talked about it when we did the podcast series on Pope Leo XIV's AI document about this anniversary tradition.
Yeah.
So now, by the time you get to Vatican II, you have an entirely new and different set of social circumstances precipitated by, on the one hand, communist, the spread of communism coming out of Russia, which is materialism, it's atheism, and it's an aggressive, violent form of socialism that is radically persecuting anybody of faith. I mean, they're just putting them to death, just straight up.
Yeah.
Okay? And then you have this kind of secular kind of materialism coming out of the West, the United States of America. That you could see even in the middle of the 1960s, this kind of increasing loss of religiosity and faith and so on and so forth. And so what Vatican II found itself needing to do is to define and to address an aspect of religious liberty and civil and the liberty of conscience, which prior to that had never really been addressed and didn't really need to be because we were dealing with a different context socially and historically.
Yeah.
And that is that you weren't dealing with open the same kind of open religious persecution that was coming from atheistic communism and the radical kind of materialism.
Okay.
So what the Church at Vatican II in Dignitatis Humanae, it says, we affirm everything that the Church has said prior to this. That's in the first paragraph or two of the document. But we have to assert that the individual has the right of religious liberty and the right of the liberty of conscience in the face of civil authority. So no government, no state has the right to force people under penalty of persecution and death to deny the faith.
Right.
And so if we live in a pluralistic and secular country, we have a right to act according to the liberty of our own conscience.
Yeah.
And we have the right to exercise that responsibility to not only seek the truth of God and embrace the truth of God, but to worship God according to the way God intends for us to worship.
Okay.
Okay? Now, here's what happened. Admittedly, and I'll say this, because of my own studies and research into this, Dignitatis Humanae was not promulgated at the highest level of authority, and it was ambiguous in certain places, and there was a need to clarify how it was to be positioned relative to what came before. What came before it.
Okay.
In my opinion, John Paul II clarified all of that. So when you read what the Catechism says today, whatever was kind of like loose and a little bit squishy has gotten shored up.
Okay.
And it's solid. But the problem with Archbishop Lefebvre, he's from France. He's from a noble family that was displaced by the French revolutionaries. They lost their ancestral land. His own ancestors were murdered and killed by the French regime. So when he read Dignitatis Humanae, he said, over my dead body, are we going to sell out to the French revolutionaries? Because that's how he interpreted the document.
Okay.
And I would say that, 50, 60 years later, I just think that's intellectually dishonest. I just do. And I think the magisterium has very much clarified the issue. So I don't think the Society of St. Pius X has any ground to stand on with respect to the actual magisterium's teaching on religious liberty. It's not a compromise. It's not a change in doctrine. It doesn't violate tradition. It is addressing a different issue within the larger picture of human dignity and human liberty that in previous decades the church never had to address because it wasn't the driving issue, even under Pius the 10th or the 11th.
Okay.
But the reason why they side with Pius X, they sort of end there. They're like, he's our guy, is because, as I was explaining earlier with Pius XI, Pius XII, you see this kind of gradual movement towards what Vatican II eventually formulated in Dignitatis Humanae. And he says, well, the only person that we can really trust on this issue is Pius X.
Yep.
But actually the seeds of what Vatican II said were already laid in what Leo XIII stated, if you actually read it carefully and with a kind of hermeneutic of continuity. You see that there's a development of doctrine that's taken place that's necessary because we live in a pluralistic society now. We live in a largely secular context, and Catholics face a different set of issues. So, for example, if I'm a Catholic judge or I'm a Catholic doctor, say, and I work at a hospital that tells me that I have to perform abortions, Dignitatis Humanae would say, no, I don't. Because as a human being, I have the dignity and the right to practice medicine according to my conscience. But if I took that same formulation and that same context, or that same way of understanding liberty, and went back to the French Revolution and asserted that, I would be saying something radically different and something that would be radically incompatible with the Catholic faith.
Yeah.
You see, does that make sense?
It does.
That kind of
so
evolution?
their take on it, or his take on it, Lefebvre, was that did he feel like it just went too far? That it was too gray,
He felt it was a break with the established doctrine of the church. Now, part of going back to what I said at the very beginning, a lot of people interpreted Dignitatis Humanae exactly in the spirit of the French Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Catholics did.
Yeah.
Said, finally, the church has reconciled herself to liberalism in the modern age.
So they took it as, I can sort of make it up as I want to.
It's totally a private matter. It's individualistic. All these things. I don't have that responsibility and obligation.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of hard to make the case to Lefebvre that Vatican II didn't get it wrong when you got a whole bunch of people that are now interpreting the council document in exactly that light. Well, only the devil is smart enough to drive that wedge into the heart of the church.
Yeah.
And that's why John Paul II had to clarify, and he did. And this is where our faith in the magisterium and our faith in the indefectibility of the church and ultimately our faith in Jesus to lead the church becomes so important, because we're going to have to ride out the storms and the waves of human history in the life of the church. And if we for a second think that I can stand up and say the church is wrong on a matter of doctrine and official teaching, then I'm not a Catholic anymore. I'm a Protestant.
Right, sure.
Of one sort or another. Maybe
Yeah.
not a Protestant from the Reformation, but I'm operating in that same spirit. And that's the irony of it, is that in his defiance, he ended up becoming the very thing that he despised.
Right.
He became individualistic. He
Yeah.
became Protestant
Yeah.
in his stance, and he defied the Holy See, and that's why he was excommunicated eventually. And that's the tragedy of it, that he had legitimate concerns because the document wasn't good enough yet. It needed to it needed some work. But what was being asserted there, we know in hindsight, was right. It was consistent with the church's teaching, but it was dealing with a different issue that we had to deal with now.
So it sounds like what he lacked was patience and trust. Like
Yeah.
the patience to sort of let it unfold and develop, and the trust that it's gonna end up okay.
Well, and
Like
probably it came from a place of deep fear that the church he loved was selling out to the spirit of revolution that destroyed his country and his faith, his family. His family's history, generation or two previous. So it's not like I can't sympathize with that. But at the end of the day, schism is not the solution to the problem.
Sure, right.
And that, and you could say the same thing about liturgy. The way the liturgical reforms were implemented was co-opted by people with agendas that weren't aligned with the Council Fathers. And so it's hard to make the case to say, well, there was a lot of innovation and a lot of cult of personality and a lot of things that played out in the 70s and 80s that kind of wrecked liturgy. And it's hard to not look back and say, well, the council was wrong. We should have just left. But I don't agree with that because I think that there were real issues prior to the council, that the council had to implement the reforms it did, but the way those reforms were implemented went off the rails. And so while I can sympathize with people in the TLM community, the kind of subversive insubordination that we've seen is not in the spirit of unity and charity, and it's not pleasing to God. And I think we've clarified the issues. I think we, are much closer to where, we have a long way to go, but we're way far away from where we were in the 70s or 80s, trust me on that. But it's not that liturgy is spectacular, but, it's better, and it needs to get better. And then the other issue is ecumenism was the other big stumbling block, because prior to the council, the church had a very, very hard stance, a very condemning stance against Protestants.
Okay.
And that's because Protestants were constantly, you could say, sort of stealing Catholics away from the church because, but I don't know if I even agree with that way of putting it, because there were a lot of problems inside the Catholic Church that was precipitating the conditions that would draw Catholics away. Just like today, like when the parish is kind of like dead, and you go to your neighboring evangelical, megachurch, it seems like it's more life-giving. Well, don't blame them. Look at our parishes and say, well, maybe they got to be more life-giving and more vibrant so that doesn't happen. But it's the same kind of thing. So ecumenism is like, why are we talking to these people? We invited them to the council. Like, why are we dialoguing? And I think the church in her wisdom is saying it's because there's two sides to every story. And maybe we need to dialogue and we need to listen, not because we need to change our doctrine, but because we need to understand where they're coming from, and maybe it'll give us eyes to see more deeply what we in fact really believe as Catholics and where we may have gotten off the reservation ourselves, like our own prejudices. Have we harbored hatred and a spirit of meanness and rejection on the part of people that belong to Christ too? And again, Vatican II needed to sort that out. Like, is a Protestant baptism valid? Are Protestants Christians? So in the documents around, ecumenism and religious dialogue, those two documents tried to address and sort out what was at the time a thorny and messy issue, to try to lay down some clear principles Here's what we share in common. Here's what we can come together around. And here's where we clearly disagree, and we will never be able to concede.
Right.
And Lefebvre just said, sorry, unacceptable. And again, it's like, when you look at what happened in the 70s around religious dialogue, it's like, we became sheepish. We cowered to, we bent and compromised in so many ways, like on a pastoral level, to quote unquote the spirit of Vatican II, where ecumenism became like, oh, we're basically all the same and all paths lead to the same end. And,
right.
Why don't we just have mutual celebrations? We'll do the Anglican thing and then we'll do the Baptist thing. And like a lot of that was happening, and it kind of betrayed and co-opted, in fact, with the council documents laid out for us.
Yeah.
Now, again, I think most of that's all sorted out, and that stuff is not happening like it used to, and it just took time,
Yeah.
So I it's a lot, but
So what do they want? Like, why is this still, and why has it been, decades in the making? Like, what do they want, and why is this a problem in the church?
Well, I think that what they want ultimately is for the church to renounce Dignitatis Humanae and the documents on interreligious dialogue, and they want to go back to at least to the 1962 missal, if not a prior missal to that.
Okay.
Yeah, and if Rome's willing to do that, then they'll come back into union with the church. But the problem
But
with
it sounds like Rome is coming into union with them.
Yes,
is what they.
And that's the problem. The problem is that makes them the governing authority, and that the only way that Rome would concede that point is by accepting the fact that somehow along the way Rome lost its authority to govern the church and did something that it wasn't supposed to do. And of course, Rome can't do that because that didn't happen.
Yeah.
So they're the ones that have to accept the clarifications which have been made. And when it comes to religious liberty, it comes down to the society agreeing that the church is right on the issue of liberty of conscience when it comes to the civil law and secular pluralism, and all that. Like, the church is right.
Yeah.
And even though we don't have a clear articulation of that, it's a proper and it's a consistent and it's an appropriate development of doctrine that's necessary for our time. And they simply won't concede to that. And they also won't concede to the Novus Ordo. The Novus Ordo, they think, is
the current mass like that. So here's my sort of simplified take on all of this. There is a real need for patience. In any time the church, if there's like a shift and the church is trying to figure out their place, like in a shifting world, or where we stand, what do we believe? Like that stuff is going to take time, okay?
Yeah.
So one, we have to be patient to let it unfold. And we have to trust that the church is guided by the Holy Spirit until the end of time to be able to sort through these things. Like, once we lose that trust, it's gone. Like, the whole foundation of the thing is gone. Like, so you have to, even if it might not seem like it makes sense, or it's going the way you think it should go, you have to trust that it's going to end up well. It's going to end up right. And
it does.
So
that's the thing.
Right.
When you're living through the storm, it can be panic inducing.
Yeah.
But if you look back and you study church history, we've had many storms. But the Orthodox faith always wins.
So it's like to be a part of a movement that is neither of those things. It seems to be very impatient, and it seems to be lacking a real basic trust in the kind of authority of the church to lead us. that seems so, I don't know, like it's very problematic to me. Like it's
Yeah.
just going to lead to, like, it's like what you're saying. The Protestants are sort of like, over the years they've now, reached like 30 some thousand different versions of what they think is the truth, and that's where that leads to this just completely continually divided and disunified kind of, theology. And I don't know, that doesn't seem right to me. It's amazing. It's always fascinating to me that people can feel so completely right in being separated like that. Like, no, what I believe is so right, it's worth being separated from the church, like from, you know what I mean? Like,
I do, and
it's a
I
very
think it
strange.
happens when it becomes very personal for the people or the person
Yeah.
or the group, where there's deep wounds and deep pain, and also when there's a lot of fear. I think that Jesus's lesson to the apostles during the storm at sea, when he's asleep and they're panicking. I always joke, they were mad because they wanted him to wake up and help them bail the water out of the boat so they wouldn't sink. Aren't you concerned that we're perishing? And Jesus is sleeping, so clearly he's not worried about it
Mm-hmm.
because he can calm the sea. But the lesson in that for the apostles and why the Lord allowed that storm to happen is like, do you believe? Do you trust me or don't you? Do you trust that I'm commandeering the ship, and not only that, but I control the sea on which the ship is sailing?
Mm.
Like, I understand that right now, the church, the bark of Peter, this boat that we're all on, is we're in a stormy sea right now. But I control the sea.
Yeah.
It's not just I control the boat on the sea. I control the sea. So if the sea's rough right now and you're on the boat getting tossed about on the waves, I'm doing that for a purpose. And the purpose is do you trust me? Because if you don't trust me, everything's going to go wrong. But do you trust me? And if you do trust me, then ride out the storm with me. It's going to be fine.
Yeah.
Something is being worked out right now in the church that has to be worked out the hard way. And you want an easy, clean, kind of solution.
Yeah.
And there isn't one. So if you want to work modernism out of the church, you got to let the virus run its course and take good care of the body. What you're trying to do is trying to cut it out like a cancer. Well, good luck cutting out a virus. It's in every cell. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah,
Like you got to build up your immunity. So the wisdom of, I think, the popes that we've had this entire time, and the wisdom of Christ, of course, governing the church, is that, yeah, we have a problem. The modern age has infected the church, but the church is going to heal by building up its immunity to error by learning to trust and have a deeper commitment to what Christ has taught us and just to cling to him.
Yeah.
And whenever I make myself the rule and measure, like the tradition as interpreted by the magisterium, it decides for me.
Yeah.
Right? When I decide for the tradition and the magisterium, I'm not Catholic anymore. I'm not even Christian anymore.
Yeah. Well,
okay, I can't go that far.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
too much. But I'm not Catholic anymore. And I and the problem is like I've always said, I'm standing on a limb and I'm trying to protect the limb. No, I'm standing on a limb and I'm trying to protect the tree, but I'm sawing the limb from the tree I'm trying to protect.
Yeah.
It's not going to end well.
Well, okay, so two things. One, I do appreciate the background to all of this, which helps to understand why people movements are happening, and versus just having this reaction of, which would be mine, like, that's dumb, and then
Going back to the beginning.
Yes, but and then the last thing I'll say for myself, as someone who struggles with kind of authority, one of the greatest lessons that I've learned is the peace that's found in, because it's not about just like throwing up your hands and being like, okay, whatever you want to do, I'm not going to have any opinion, or I'm not going to, like, it's okay to share the concerns. It's okay to push back whenever you might feel something is not right or it needs questioned or challenged. But it's another thing to push back to the degree where you start to usurp like real authority. And I was always on the verge of doing that, like whether I disagreed with a pastor that I was working for, and I'd almost want to stage a coup, you know. But honestly, the most peace I've ever discovered was, okay, I feel like I've shared, all of my concerns, all of my thoughts that pertain to this particular thing. And at this point, it's out of my hands. Like I'm not the one in control. Like God has put somebody in that position, allowed somebody to be there, whether or not I agree with what they're doing. But, so it's not about being a passive like recipient constantly. But you have to find that line where you're expressing your disappointment, you're expressing your concerns without crossing that line of like, well, I'm just going to leave because I don't like you as the natural authority figure in this.
Yeah. No, I mean, I couldn't agree more. The image I have, going back to the boat again, is just like, if you get a leak and the water is coming in to the boat, which happens, the culture and the spirit of our age gets into the church, you don't cut one of the planks out of the bottom of the boat to plug the hole. And that's exactly because you're just going to sink faster.
Yeah.
And that's what's happened since the especially since the Francis pontificate is, the hyper reaction. What we have to do is we have to trust in Jesus. And we also keep in mind that doctrine evolves, or doctrine develops. And the church has to sometimes apply principles to new circumstances, which leads to new developments in what we need to understand about that core truth. Likewise, liturgical worship evolves. The essence doesn't. The essence of liturgy will never depart from what Christ fundamentally established for us. But the incidentals, the conventions, the cultural, dressings of the liturgy, they are going to change as the church discerns and deems necessary. And we just have to trust that. And we have to live through a time in which those changes are taking place. The fundamental posture we need to have is to trust. Trust the Lord and to trust the authorities that He's established. And try to be curious and try to open our hearts up. I always try to do it this way. Lord, what are you trying to teach us right now? What do you need me to see differently? Or what do you need me to open my eyes to? Because your church is speaking right now. Your church is acting right now. And I trust that it's fundamentally always going to go in the right direction, even though it might zigzag a little bit. And how can I grow holier through this time in this process? I wasn't always like that, but I think that's what we have to be able to do. And if we get too rigid and too insistent on our particular way of seeing the matter, then what ends up happening is we find ourselves in greater and greater contention with the established authorities. And if we take it far enough, we're going to finally break away. And that's what, the Lefebvrites have done. And it's sad because it's not to say that their zeal and their earnestness isn't, seeking a good and upright and holy thing, but they've appointed to themselves an authority that they simply do not have, even as an individual archbishop. If you're not in union with Peter in the College of Bishops, I mean, there was there were some dissenting votes on the document. And the other thing I would say is that, Vatican II, some of the documents were dogmatically promulgated, and therefore they're dogma. Others were not. They were constitutions, and constitutions established doctrinal truths, but were also somewhat exploratory and left open to further refinement and further consideration. The Church has not fundamentally rejected the position stated in Dignitatis Humanae. It's only clarified it and refined it and addressed the ambiguities or the concerns or the questions that came up afterwards. And it's a settled matter now. It's in the catechism.
Yeah.
And same thing with the liturgy is, where it is because of what the church has, said.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
how we're going to do it.
Yeah.
And same thing with ecumenism, interreligious dialogue, all of that. These issues are established stances and positions of the church that we, to whatever degree is appropriate for us, we're obligated to embrace these teachings and apply them to our lives as faithful Catholics to the best of our ability, because it represents both the mind and the heart of Jesus for our time and in our place. And I think that if we can embrace that spirit and that disposition, then we're not going to be we're going to be able to ride out the storm with peace in our hearts and not panic.
For sure.
So
wrap it up.
All right. Well, I always feel bad if I lecture too long and I go on and on and on, but I also understand that I'm blessed to have studied all of this stuff. So I hope what I've shared with you has been fruitful and helpful for you to understand what's going on with, the Society of St. Pius X, and even a lot of the people inside the church who are sympathetic to the traditional Latin Mass and so forth. So, always we have to have the heart of Christ. We have to approach our brothers and sisters in the faith with charity and humility, but we also have to have a certain degree of fidelity to Christ through the magisterium of the church and the governing body of the church that's leading us in our time right now. So I hope that all of this is clarified, maybe, how this all played out and how we should stand in the midst of this storm that we are kind of living through right now. Take care. We'll see you in the next episode.
See ya.
The Wise Guys Podcast is a production of Preambula Group, a Catholic ministry dedicated to helping you thrive in the heart of Jesus. Visit us on the web at preambula.org and follow us on social media.